One swing of the axe, one head rolls through the English grass, and a forbidden love is buried in silence. June 19th, 1312. Blacklow Hill, a lonely rise in Warwickshire, now forgotten by most, once stained with royal blood. A man kneels in the morning dew, eyes closed, lips murmuring a final prayer. Around him, silence. No crowd, no ceremony. Just two Welsh swordsmen and an unmarked grave waiting nearby. Then the steel comes down, one clean stroke. His head falls forward, his blood mingles with the earth, and a chapter of England's history ends in absolute stillness. The victim? Piers Gaveston, a foreign knight from Gascony, a man with no royal blood, no noble claim, except that he held the heart of the most powerful man in the kingdom, King Edward II. For nearly a decade, Piers had lived closer to the English throne than any other, not through battle, not through lineage, through love, through charm, through something far more dangerous in a medieval world ruled by rigid hierarchies: emotional influence. Together, Edward and Piers defied centuries of protocol. The king showered him with titles, jewels, estates meant for princes. He sat beside the throne. He wore the crown's jewels at banquets. At Edward's own wedding to a French princess, Gaveston appeared more regal than the queen herself. To some, he was a parasite, a manipulative upstart who seduced the king and divided the realm. To others, he was a victim, targeted for his foreign blood, his ambition, and above all, for being loved too much. What really killed Piers Gaveston? Was it ambition, arrogance, homophobia, politics? Or was it simply this? He became the one man in England more powerful than its nobles, without ever lifting a sword. From a forgotten foreign knight to the beating heart of England's future king. He didn't come from power. He didn't come from wealth. Piers Gaveston was the son of a minor Gascon knight, born far from London's courtly grandeur in the sun-baked hills of Aquitaine. But what he lacked in bloodline, he made up for with something far more dangerous: charm. He was fluent in multiple languages, skilled with a sword, and dangerously handsome, with dark eyes that lingered too long and a smile that could disarm suspicion. At court, he dazzled. While other men bowed, Gaveston watched. While others obeyed, he joked. It didn't take long before Prince Edward, the heir to the English throne, took notice. And once he did, he never looked away. What began as camaraderie between young nobles quickly turned into obsession. The two men became inseparable. They hunted together, trained together, stayed up through the night debating poetry and playing music by candlelight. Edward was tall, broad-shouldered, the very image of a warrior prince, but his passions lay far from the battlefield. He was introspective, artistic, and painfully lonely. And then came Piers. Theirs wasn't a romance by today's definitions, at least not one recorded in explicit words. But to everyone watching, something was clear. Piers didn't just understand Edward. He completed him. He filled the silence that no royal tutor, knight, or counselor could. And Edward, hungry for affection in a court built on calculation, gave Gaveston everything: his trust, his time, his secrets, and soon his power. It was more than friendship. It was more than loyalty. It was something England had never seen before. One chronicler recorded King Edward I privately saying, "Piers Gaveston is more dangerous to my son than all of Scotland." The alarm bells were already ringing. Edward I, known as Longshanks, the iron-willed king who crushed the Scots and terrorized Wales, was not a sentimental man. He ruled with sword and strategy, not sentiment. And he saw in Gaveston not just a distraction, but a disease, a foreigner, Gascon by birth, who had somehow wrapped himself around the future king's heart. Edward I tried subtlety. He removed Piers from court, reassigned him to remote garrisons. But each time the prince found a way to pull him back. Finally, in 1307, the old king acted with the ruthlessness of a man at war. He exiled Gaveston from England entirely. No trial, no negotiation, just a decree and a ship waiting to take the favorite far from Edward's arms. The reaction? Chaos. Edward reportedly fell into despair, begging on his knees before his father to reconsider. But the old king remained unmoved. Gaveston was banished, and the throne, at least temporarily, was safe. Or so he thought. Because just months later, Edward I died during a campaign in Scotland. And now the boy who had once begged for love held absolute power. But behind the throne, a shadow is returning. Edward's first act as king wasn't a decree of peace. It wasn't a victory tour. It wasn't even a marriage alliance. It was this. He called Piers Gaveston back, and not just back to court, but straight into the very center of royal power. He didn't just bring back the man who had scandalized a generation. He gave him a title reserved for royal blood, Earl of Cornwall, a king's ransom in land, wealth, and prestige. Suddenly, Gaveston wasn't just a favorite, he was untouchable. But power given freely always breeds resentment. And in the shadows of the royal court, old enemies were beginning to whisper. Doi jai la body hai, the king's first decree, bring him back. Viet theo yo cowboy jodai hopli, gyong van jian an, tun hien, pu hop van hua khan giami. Noidung bam sat mctruyen ja viet o shuang mot va fa trien xahon, jambao tang hip kang tang, vekoiva mora kichtain sho chuang tiep theo. The crown was barely on his head when he summoned the man who cost him everything. It was July 1307. The body of Edward I had not yet cooled, and his son, now Edward II, stood before a silent court of grieving nobles. In theory, he was now England's sovereign. In practice, everyone waited to see if he would be his father's son or his own man. He answered swiftly. His very first royal order? Bring back Piers Gaveston. The favorite who had been exiled by royal command was not only recalled to England, but elevated. Gaveston returned not as a guest, nor even as a subject, but as a peer of the realm. Edward granted him the Earldom of Cornwall, one of the richest and most prestigious titles in England, a title traditionally reserved for members of the royal family. The court was stunned. The barons murmured. The French emissaries whispered. The church stiffened in its robes. But Edward didn't care. He had spent too long waiting. Now that he was king, he would love openly and reward fiercely. Gaveston was back, and this time, he would not be taken away again. They were inseparable, again, and now they ruled together. At royal banquets, Piers was seen wearing the crown jewels, sitting beside the throne like a second monarch. One guest whispered, "It is no longer the King of England. It is the king and his shadow." Gaveston, newly titled and armored in arrogance, wasted no time expanding his reach. He attended council meetings, directed foreign policy, even appointed judges. More scandalous still, he began mocking the noble lords openly, giving them cruel nicknames and laughing at them during feasts. The old warriors who had bled under Edward I now found themselves sidelined by a foreign upstart in purple silks. To many in the kingdom, this wasn't just favoritism, it was humiliation. And it wasn't just about love, it was about power. Real, dangerous, national power in the hands of a man who didn't inherit it, didn't earn it, but had simply captured the king's heart. In the eyes of the barons, this wasn't courtly love. It was treason in silk. Isabella of France was already en route, Edward's bride-to-be, a political match meant to unite two powerful nations. But behind the palace walls, England's nobility was boiling. Their king was distracted. Their influence was vanishing. And the man at the center of it all? Smiling, untouchable, dangerous. And somewhere in the shadows, men began to murmur, "If the king will not rid us of Gaveston, we will do it ourselves." The wedding of a king, the humiliation of a queen, and a lover who outshone them both. January 13, 08. The great cathedral of Notre Dame glittered with candlelight. Royal banners fluttered. French nobles gathered to witness a union that was supposed to seal peace between two mighty kingdoms, England and France. At the altar stood Isabella of France, daughter of King Philip IV, only 12 years old but raised to rule. Groomed in diplomacy, refined in etiquette, she was the crown jewel of Capetian royalty. But her wedding day was not hers, because standing beside Edward II wasn't just his future wife, it was Piers Gaveston, draped in velvet, dripping with jewels and smiling like he was the true consort of the King of England. Observers were horrified. French envoys sent home reports that Edward showed more affection to Gaveston than to Isabella. Some claimed Gaveston's clothing was more ornate than the king's. Others whispered that the jewels he wore had been gifts from the French crown, meant for Isabella, but handed to him before the ceremony. One chronicler recorded, "The king gave to his favorite what rightfully belonged to his queen, attention, affection, and treasure." The French court was insulted. Isabella's family was outraged. And the young queen herself? She said nothing, but she saw everything. She knew what it meant to be dismissed in public. She knew that power often hid behind smiles. And she understood, even at 12, that the game she had been born into was already rigged against her. The honeymoon was no better. Gaveston traveled with them. He dined at the king's table. He received gifts that should have belonged to the queen. Edward didn't even try to hide his favoritism. He lavished Piers with estates, privileges, honors. Isabella, the bride of England, became a footnote at her own coronation. But while the court seethed and the queen watched in silence, outside the palace walls, something far more dangerous was brewing. The barons, once merely irritated, now felt provoked, disrespected, displaced. They had tolerated Edward's eccentricities, but now it wasn't just politics, it was personal. Their loyalty was being mocked, their power was being undermined, their queen was being insulted, and the entire realm watched it happen in stunned disbelief. Someone would pay for this, and the crown itself would bleed for it. They couldn't kill the king, but they could destroy his heart. By 1309, the situation at court had turned toxic. The nobles, once the backbone of Edward I's mighty realm, now found themselves sidelined by a single man, Piers Gaveston. He wasn't just advising the king, he was influencing appointments, military decisions, taxation, and worst of all, he was enjoying it. He gave mocking nicknames to the realm's most powerful lords. Thomas of Lancaster, the king's cousin and England's richest noble, he called the Actor. Guy of Warwick became the Black Dog of Arden. These weren't private jests. They were public humiliations, delivered in front of the court, often at royal feasts. For men who had shed blood for the crown, this wasn't just insult, it was intolerable betrayal. One noble was overheard saying, "If Gaveston returns again, he will not leave England alive." They met in secret. Powerful men, mortal enemies once, now allies in desperation. Together they formed a plan, not to assassinate the king, but to strip him of his power, piece by piece. And so in 1310, under mounting pressure, Edward was forced to agree to the creation of the Lords Ordainers, a council of 21 barons and bishops. Their task, reform the realm, curtail royal abuse, and deal with the Gaveston problem once and for all. 1 year later, their verdict was clear. In October 1311, the ordinances were published, a series of harsh laws that stripped Edward of key powers, demanded the return of misused funds, and most crucially, Gaveston must be exiled, permanently. This time it came with teeth. If Piers ever returned to English soil, he would be executed. No trial, no appeal, just the axe. The king's reaction was predictable and devastating. Edward delayed, resisted, pleaded, but he was politically cornered. The nobles controlled the military, the treasury, the ports, even the people. So Gaveston, again, was forced to leave. He boarded a ship to Flanders in December 1311. But this exile was different. It wasn't gilded with promises, it wasn't veiled in diplomacy, it was a warning, a death sentence with a clock ticking in the background. And yet, from across the channel, letters flew like whispers in the dark. Edward and Piers never stopped writing to one another. In his own hand, the king wrote, "My heart is empty without you. I cannot rule in your absence. I will move heaven and earth to bring you home." And as promised, he began secretly raising an army, offering lands, titles, and gold to any man who would fight for the return of his beloved. England was no longer ruled by policy, it was ruled by longing. While the barons planned order, the king plotted war. On June 19, 1312, the man who had once ruled England's heart was left headless on a hill. They brought Piers Gaveston to Blacklow Hill at dawn. No trial, no priest, no mercy. The site was not chosen by chance. It belonged to Guy of Warwick, one of the very men Gaveston had mocked. This was vengeance written in geography. Two Welsh swordsmen, chosen for their skill, delivered the fatal blow. One strike, the head rolled, and the blood of the king's favorite soaked the soil of his enemies. But the killing didn't end the crisis. England did not stabilize. It bled. Edward II, shattered by Gaveston's death, never forgave. Over the next decade, he hunted those responsible. The mastermind, Thomas of Lancaster, was captured and executed for treason in 1322. But revenge did not bring peace, because in a cruel twist of fate, Edward himself would suffer the same betrayal. In 1327, he was deposed by none other than his wife, Isabella of France, the queen humiliated by Gaveston's presence on her wedding day. With her lover, Roger Mortimer, she orchestrated the king's arrest and his gruesome murder. At Berkeley Castle, it's said Edward II was tortured with a red-hot poker inserted into his bowels in a grotesque mockery of the love that had once defied England's nobility. And yet, despite everything, Gaveston was never tried for any crime. His execution was carried out in secret, under the guise of justice, but without law, without process. The chronicles called him greedy, flamboyant, corrupt. They painted him as a parasite who wore jewels meant for queens and mocked warriors from the safety of silk cushions. But the financial records say otherwise. Much of his wealth reverted to the crown. The lands he held were not plundered, but legally granted. In fact, many of the most damning accounts came from chroniclers paid by the very nobles who conspired to kill him. So what was he really? A cunning manipulator? A social climber? Or a man who simply loved and paid for it with his life? Piers Gaveston remains a mirror, held up to a world that feared what it could not control. A man who climbed too high, loved too openly, and became a legend not because he ruled, but because he dared to matter.